All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. And this one right here, this one's kind of long, so I'm going to jump straight into it. So anyways, I'm going to take you guys back to 2017. This story right here took place in a prison that I very rarely talk about because there's just not a whole lot happening in that prison. And throughout the past, that prison has had a sketchy history as far as it being designated as a bad prison, a place where you do not want to go if you're active. But I'm talking about Susanville. But believe it or not, even though we're talking about Susanville, shit does kick off, and this is a good story. So anyways, like I said, I'm going to take you guys back to 2017 when these events took place. And ironically, this just so happened to be the last main line that I was on almost 34 years ago. Damn, that makes me feel old. 34 years ago, I was actually in Susanville on Lassen Yard, the level 3 yard. And I was on that yard right around the time when they just started breaking ground and building High Desert. I know that Susanville, also known as Susie's house, has obviously changed over that 30-year time span. But this was a prison that was always known to be a place where they sent a lot of first-termers that were camp eligible, guys that were getting ready to go to camp. Level 1 and 2 gangsters. So before I get into this story, let me just say this. Another thing that Susanville has always had a history of, or has always been notorious for, is people dropping kites and people working with the administration to get you off the yards. So in prison, a 1030 confidential disclosure form is something you'll be issued when someone provides confidential information about you. And because Susanville has always been known for this, a common term that's always been said about Susanville is that it's always 1030 at Susie's house. So here's a little background about Susanville. Susanville has always been a lower level type of prison, especially back between 1989 and 1992 when I was there, 30 something years ago. You had a handful of other prisons that were kind of like Susanville that they'd send you to if you were camp eligible or camp qualified. Susanville and Jamestown were the two front runners. But then you also had prisons like Solano, CMC West, and a few others. So when I was in Susanville back in 1989, there was 3 yards. Level 1 yard, a level 2 yard, and a level 3 yard. The 1 yard was called Cascade. The 2 yard was called Sierra, and the 3 yard was called Lassen. To this day, I believe they still call them the same. In fact, if my memory serves me right, I think Susanville is actually on the verge of getting shut down. Don't quote me on that, but I could have swore that I read something or I heard something about that recently. When I landed in Susanville in 1989, I hit the 2 yard. Then something ended up kicking off on the 2 yard. My points went up, I went to the hole, and they shot me to the 3 yard. After I was on the 3 yard for a very short period of time, something else kicked off over there. There was a little melee, and then I ended up getting validated. I actually paroled from Susanville on April 4th, 1992. And at that time, I remember seeing the heavy equipment they were using in the distance through the fences that they were using to break ground and build High Desert. They had just started to build High Desert in 1992. So now you basically have Susanville and High Desert that are in close proximity to each other. They're right across the street from each other. Building prisons in close proximity to each other has proven to be more efficient for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. That's why it's been duplicated many times over the past with other prisons like Solano and Vacaville, Old Corcoran and New Corcoran, Old Folsom and New Folsom, and then Kern Valley and North Kern Valley. So throughout the past, it's been common for them to do that. And after all, for these small towns, building prisons in their backyard is a major financial come up for a lot of these smaller communities that are way out there in the boondocks that have nothing going on. It's called corporate America, and prisons for a lot of people is job security. So anyways, my source, who I'm now going to refer to as Squeaks from Whittier, originally hit the 2 yard in 2017 and was there with another guy who went by Tick from West Myrtle Street. So according to Squeaks, at one point, Tick from West Myrtle Street was on the 2 yard, slinging a little bit of dough, just trying to make a little bit of money. And you know how it goes. Once he started balling, somebody ended up telling on him, he got rolled up and they shot him to the hole. He didn't clarify how they caught him, but I would imagine that it was probably through one of the more traditional ways that people normally get caught up. Either through visiting, either through the mail, or they stung him getting assisted by a compromised CO. Or maybe he got caught doing some MacGyver type of shit. like flying a drone over Lassen and then making a coordinated drop in a specific location. You guys remember that video I showed you a while back where an inmate in an unknown California prison had his people on the outside run up to one of the fence's perimeters and chuck a whole duffel bag over the fence? If I can find that video, I'll incorporate it in this story and show it to you guys again. It's a pretty crazy video when you think about it, because when you can get a whole duffel bag into a prison, you can just imagine what you could get inside that duffel bag. This guy obviously identified an area of the prison that either had an unmanned gun tower, maybe that particular area wasn't being maintained, or he somehow learned that there was a lapse in their security. But either way, once he found out, it was just a matter of finding somebody with balls big enough to run up to one of the fence's perimeters and throw the goods over the fence. But let me get back on track. So when Tick got caught up, as a result, his points went up and he got reclassified to Lassen Yard, the level 3 yard. So according to Squeaks, in 2017, Susanville, that whole prison was being ran by Topito from Venice. That was his prison, and he controlled everything that happened on the 1, 2, and 3 yards. I know I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but I want to get you guys into this story because there's a lot involved in this story. So just bear with me. So fast forward a few weeks after Tick and Squeaks both end up landing on Lassen Yard. After they ended up landing on Lassen Yard, they hear that there's a shakeup in the leadership. And being that neither Squeaks or Tick were Mexican Mafia members, they weren't privy as to the reasons why there was a shakeup. They didn't know the details or the reasoning behind it. All they knew is that somebody new was appointed to take over that prison. And according to Squeaks, when him and Tick were on the 2 yard, Tick was the appointed llavero that was overseeing that yard. So he had all the contacts. And even though he wasn't running the 3 yard, he still had these channels open. All he was told was that Topito from Venice was no longer to be acknowledged as the overall authority for that prison, and that everything now fell under Popeye from Harpies. This came down directly from one of Popeye's secretaries that Tick was in contact with himself. So by 2017, the Mexican Mafia had established an intricate network of communication with various prisons that it was active in. All the members were tapped into each other, they all had each other's numbers. Then there was a select number of other individuals or facilitators who also had certain numbers for business-related purposes. This obviously included those that might have been either drug suppliers or others who were an integral part of moving the money around. Then you had the llaveros like Tick, who acted as the understudies or the buffers for the leaders like Tonito from Venice. So keep in mind, a lot of what I'm talking about either took place on the 2 yard or took place on the 3 yard. Even though I'm kind of jumbling it all together, it doesn't matter. It's not going to confuse the story. So according to Squeaks, Tick had his own cell phone, and he used his cell phone primarily to conduct business and business-related transactions. If you're in the mix out there on the main lines, it's imperative that you have a cell phone, especially if you're networking with people on the outside and you're in direct contact with the people who are bringing the dope in. You got to have a cell phone. And because Tick was in the mix, it was imperative for him to have his own cell phone. Not only because he was moving dope out there, but also because he was running the yard. There were certain people that he needed to maintain contact with, and it had to be done in real time. You can't do that if you don't have a cell phone. Obviously, you can't use the blue phones, the recorded prison phones, or you can't wait until somebody drives 600 miles to come visit you, or code up a letter and send it out the old traditional way. You got to be able to just get on your cell phone, dial somebody's number, and get at them at the drop of a dime. I'll get into it a little bit later in this story, but having a cell phone gives you a lot of advantages, especially when you're talking about politics. Because more often than not, if you're politicking with somebody, the guy that has the cell phone, he's the one that's going to win that fight. He's the one that's going to have the advantage to reach out to certain people and paint that picture and plant those seeds before this other individual even gets a chance to open his mouth. So cell phones, they're critical in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different scenarios. So Squeak says that he didn't know the reasons behind Tonito's demotion. He didn't know why he got in trouble, what the reasons were. He didn't know none of the details. All he remembers hearing is that one of Popeye's secretaries called Tick directly and advised him of the changes. So again, going back to when Tick gets caught up on the 2-yard for attempting to smuggle drugs into the prison, he obviously went to the hole as a result that potentially carried a shoe term. It's a formality, something that's part of the process, especially considering the fact that this was a major disciplinary infraction that could have resulted in a shoe term. So he goes to ADSEG, he stays there for a couple of months until they readjust his points, they reclassify him, and then they kick him out to the level 3-yard. An individual by the name of Frost from El Monte Flores gets at him. Now, Frost wasn't a member of the Mexican Mafia, but he was a reputable sureño who was considered to be a camarada, one of the Mexican Mafia's most steadfast believers. He was also well respected on that yard, and at that point, I believe he had been down for close to 18 years. So again, when Tick gets the yard, Frost gets at him about sureños and other entities out there that owe him money for drugs. This is money that was owed to him during the time when he got rolled up. Because keep in mind, when you get rolled up for something like this, when somebody either tells on you or they just come snatch you up because they suspect you of slinging dope out there, it's not like you get an opportunity to make your rounds on the yard and get at all the people that owe you money. You just get snatched up and you're gone. Unfortunately, you don't get an opportunity to collect from all the people that owe you money at that time. But that doesn't mean that you eat those losses either. If there's not others out there who were aware of those debts and who weren't able to collect them for you, then you'll get an opportunity to collect those debts later, either when you get transferred out or when you get kicked out to another yard. But that money does get recovered. At least most of the time it does. Sometimes you got to eat those losses. But in this situation right here, a lot of the guys that owed Tick money were either still on the 2-yard or they got kicked over to the 3-yard. So he knew who everybody was, he had a list, and it was time to collect that money. It's safe to assume that while Tick was in ADSEG, he probably reached out to Frost and advised him of certain individuals out there that might have owed him money, or that there was money owed that needed to be collected out there and that it was a priority. This became a priority for Frost because it wasn't money that was owed to Tick himself personally. It was money that was owed to the Mexican Mafia due to the fact that that's who Tick was working for. Tick was just a front man who was working for the Mexican Mafia, peddling their dope and pushing their agenda. So like I said, in preparation for this day, Tick had a list with him. He knew all the people that owed him money. He had all the amounts. So this was the whole reason why Frost was getting at him. He was going to assist him in collecting those debts. And for Tick, this was probably more a priority for him as well, due to the fact that he was the one on the hook for that money, and he was responsible for making sure that that money was collected and sent to where it was supposed to go. So it wasn't long after Tick hit the 3-yard that he was contacted and advised that he was no longer working under Fox and that he was now being appointed to work under Joker from Big Hazard. None of this pertained to anything that was going on in Susanville. However, it just goes to show that Tick was tied in and that he was working for the Mexican Mafia, both behind the walls and on the outside as well. According to Squeaks, Tick at one point was working directly under Fox and was officially assigned to his crew. But again, his entire crew was being reassigned, and he was informally being assigned to now work under Joker from Big Hazard. This was probably during the time when Fox was in the LA County Jail and prior to him getting caught up in Operation Dirty Thurs. Basically, anyone who was working under Fox at that time was being reassigned to either work under Joker or Danny Boy from Big Hazard. And again, Squeaks wasn't privy to the inside details because he wasn't an Imero. But whether or not this was just another formality or another underlying serious reason, he didn't know either way. All he remembers hearing is that Tick was now going to be working under Joker from Big Hazard. And again, this apparently applied to everyone who was working under Fox at that time. They were either being reassigned to Danny Boy or Joker. The interesting thing about this was the order of priority delegated to these guys. The breadwinners were first, followed by the soldiers, and then the manpower itself. So according to Squeaks, in 2017, there was a lot of funny, underhanded shit that was going on. Not only within leadership in that whole political arena, but also at Susanville on Lassanyard as well. Squeak said that he assumed that things would eventually fall into place due to the fact that they had high desert right next door. He said that there was some reputable individuals that were right there across the street, and because they were in such close proximity, he thought that they benefit from this, meaning that the rules and expectations would eventually be pushed the same way as they were in High Desert. The other thing he based this on is that High Desert used Susanville's ad seg as a whole overflow. This meant that a lot of the guys that had influence and who were sent to the back would be brought over into the fold, and that they'd have an opportunity to work directly with them. But a lot of the things that Squeaks assumed would happen, they just weren't panning out. Things just didn't end up working out the way that he thought they would. An individual by the name of Flacco from Choppers pulled up to the yard. Flacco had just come from federal prison. He had did 12 years in federal custody, and now that he was done with his Fed time, he was there in state to finish up his state time. So before I get into Flacco's role on that yard and how he fit into the scheme of things, let me just point something out to you guys. Flacco from Choppers, who just so happens to be one of the main characters that this story is about, was actually someone who I recognized as being targeted in a prank on YouTube. True story, you can't make this stuff up. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the channel it was on, but it was on a channel called Top Notch Idiots. And basically what these guys do is one of them will pull a skit on somebody, or one of them will walk through a neighborhood that's known to be like a gang-infested neighborhood, or an area where there's a heavy presence of gang members. Then they'll look for a target. And when they spot a potential target, they'll approach him and they'll say something like, "Hey, you want to get popped or you want to get knocked out?" Usually it ends up going bad. Being that they normally target guys that look like street thugs, it normally ends when these guys flex on them or when one of them will pull a gun out and they'll try to run them down. Well, coincidentally, Flacco from Choppers just so happened to be walking in an area of LA when he was approached by these guys who were running this skit. I actually remember seeing it on YouTube way before I knew anything about this story. So at that time, I obviously didn't know nothing about Flacco, didn't know who he was, didn't know what he looked like. But then Squeaks had mentioned that he had been pranked on YouTube, and he described the prank and had me pull up the video. As soon as I seen the video, I couldn't believe that this was the individual that we were talking about, because I remembered that video. It stood out in my mind. So that's where these pictures came from. The pictures that you guys are seeing right now, this picture, that's where those came from when he got pranked. No disrespect to Flacco if he just so happens to be watching this, but when he was approached by this guy who does the skit, this guy acted like he was throwing up a gang sign and he banged on Flacco. Flacco ends up flexing on this guy. He takes his shirt off, throws his shirt at him, and he says something to the effect of, "You trying to bang on me? I'm a real gang member. Why you mad dogging me, Holmes?" It's actually pretty funny. You guys got to go check the video out. You guys see that? Right there? That's my boy Gizmo. If it's not Chewy, it's Gizmo. They always pop in at the right time. It kind of makes you wonder why they always pop in at the right time. These guys ain't stupid. They're smart. They're celebrities. They know you guys are watching. So try not to pay too much attention to Gizmo. So anyways, when Flacco asked this guy why he's mad dogging him, this guy says, "God gave me eyes. I have eyes. I'm looking." Like I said, I'm not doing it no justice. You guys got to go check the video out. I believe there's a short and then there's a full-length video. But either way, go check it out, and that video will make you appreciate this video even more. So anyways, what I gathered from Squeak is that when Flacco hit the yard, he kind of hit the yard riding on his high horse, based on the fact that there were no Bealies on the yard, no Mexican Mafia members, and also based on the fact that he just pulled up from federal prison. It was all ego-based. You got some individuals that see an opportunity to impose their will on a yard like this when there's no one there and when they know that they can get away with it. And apparently that's what Flacco did. Not only that, but there's also this perception by certain individuals who've done federal time that seem to think that they garner more influence just based on doing Fed time alone, just because they've been in federal prison. Squeaks, he actually put it in more formal terms by saying sometimes these types of guys will come in riding on their high horse like their shit don't stink. And that's how Flacco came in when he landed on that yard. So from this point on, this story is more about how Tick and Flacco collided and how this would ultimately end up leading to not only Flacco getting hit, but also Tick getting hit as well. So Squeak said that Flacco had an older brother who at one time worked for Popeye from Harpies, but that this comes into play insofar as how Tick ended up getting done dirty by Flacco and his brother. So even though everybody wasn't of the same mindset with regards to treating Flacco like he was someone special, all right, Gizmo, I holler at you, boy. Apparently, there were those that did buy into it and who felt like he did have some influence out there. More specifically, I'm referring to the Mesa and those that were part of the leadership circle on that yard. And at that time, the Mesa consisted of Frost from El Monte Flores, a paisa named Travi, and then there were 2 other open seats. Not to get off track, but the other interesting thing that Squeaks brought to my attention is that there always has to be a paisa sitting on the Mesa. And apparently, this applies to all the different California prisons. From my understanding, this seems to be predicated on the fact that Chino, Arturo Padua, a Mexican mafia member from Distrito Federal, or the Federal District, is a well-respected Imero. And then I got the impression that Chino identified more with being a paisa than he did with being a sureño, and that this provision was adopted solely out of respect for him. If I'm wrong and one of you knows something different, then by all means, clarify it for me. Otherwise, this is how I understood it. So Flacco was delegated one of the open seats on the Mesa, and he became part of the leadership on the 3-yard. Anyways, it was around this same time that Tick ended up finding himself in a dilemma. Basically, all the Sureños and all the people that he said owed him money were all claiming that they didn't owe him nothing and that he wasn't even moving dope on the 2-yard. To me, it sounded like these guys were just trying to take advantage of him. And like I said, the cool thing about it was that a handful of them were his own people that he had looked out for, other Sureños who are now denying that they were in debt with Tick. They said they didn't owe him nothing. So Frost ends up looking into it, and some of these guys, they outright denied that Tick had any money floating around on the 2-yard, that he wasn't doing nothing over there, and that he was just trying to get people caught up. Scandalous dope fiend shit. Thousands of dollars ended up being owed to him. And what you guys got to remember, keep in mind, is this wasn't Tick's money. He was working for Joker, and now he was the one that was on the hook for this money that was owed to him. It ended up getting so bad that Tick propositioned Frost by telling him, look, these guys that are saying that they don't owe me no money, he's like, I'm going to get my money one way or the other. Allow me an opportunity to strap up with these individuals, to take them in the cell and to deal with it. They want to act stupid and act like they don't owe me no money. They want to see me get crossed up. Then let me go in a cell with them and handle my business. Because again, for Tick, he was in a real dilemma. Guys get caught up all the time for owing debts. And this wasn't no small debt. Like I said, this was thousands of dollars. It wasn't like he could just write it off and let it go, because he was still in debt and he didn't have the resources to cover it. From the impression that I got from Squeaks, Tick started to feel an overwhelming sense of desperation because of this. Not just because these other guys were trying to play him like he was a sucker, but more so because he began to feel like they were trying to cross him up. And that's basically what it came down to. Either Tick or them. Joker wouldn't have been placated by the excuses that these guys are now saying that they don't owe him money. Joker wouldn't have been placated by the excuse that these guys are now playing games and that they were balking at paying back these debts. Joker would have been furious, and he would have been condescending towards Tick for not stepping up and for even asking Joker how to resolve that situation. He probably would have said something to the effect of, what do I gotta do, hold your hand and do it for you? If them dudes don't want to pay those debts back, then whack every last one of them on that yard. Period. But here's where Flacco comes into play and begins to complicate things even more for Tick, now that he had been delegated a position on the Mesa. Squeaks described Flacco as the type of individual who would become real dismissive in situations like this. He said, if you brought something to Flacco's attention, regardless to what it was, he would just make these faces like, here comes this dude complaining again. Here comes this dude with all his complaints. Almost like he was too good to hear about the issues. He would just be dismissive about it. And then Squeaks described him as the kind of guy that would always cut you off when you were trying to make a point. He'd cut you off and start drawing his own conclusions before he even heard the whole story. And I know exactly what type of individuals Squeaks talking about. So fast forward a few weeks. Frost, he ends up getting ready to parole. He's getting ready to go home. He's been down almost 18 years and his parole date comes up. He now has a responsibility to start passing everything down to whoever he's going to leave his position to. the next llavero who's going to take over the yard. You know, the goal is obviously to always go with the best suited candidate and the one who will make the smoothest transition. There's a lot of different factors that get weighed out when there's an individual that's appointing the next llavero, the person who's going to resume overseeing that yard. But in this particular situation, Frost felt like the best two candidates were either Flaco or Tick. Flaco because of his experience and his ability to assert his influence on the yard. Besides that, he'd been down over 12 years, and Frost obviously felt like he carried leadership abilities on some level. But on the flip side, Squeak said that Tick had a lot more experience, hands-on experience on that yard, and he had solid rapport with all the secretaries that he was already in contact with. They already had a system established, he already knew all the codes, and bringing somebody else in at that point would have just slowed everything down. Squeaks also mentioned that one of Popeye's facilitators, a guy named Stroller from Tunerville, was also someone new who Tick had been working with. At that time, I guess Stroller was sold up with Popeye. Squeaks didn't use the title secretary, so I don't want to assume that that's what Stroller was, so I'm just going to say he was one of his facilitators. In fact, for those of you who really get into these stories, you might have remembered the story that I ran on Big Evil from Colonia Chiques. In that story, I mentioned that Stroller from Tunerville and Malo from Westside Locals were part of the Mexican Mafia's faction that was operating in Mexico. This is the same Stroller that Squeaks mentioned, only at that time, Stroller hadn't been made yet. You should be looking at a picture of Stroller right here. So the other thing that was going on in Susanville in 2017 at that time was that they were flipping the 1 and 2 yards. They were flipping the yards. A lot of dudes were getting hurt by the COs. There was a lot of medical malpractice suits that were being filed. There were civil suits being filed. There was just a lot going on at that time. And this just complicated things. Everybody had issues. So for whatever reason, Frost elected to leave the yard to Flaco. Despite the fact that Tick had more experience out there, and despite the fact that he would have been a smoother transition. So Frost, he ends up paroling, Flaco takes over, and Tick, he kind of just tries to fall back. He wasn't trying to get caught up. He wasn't trying to bump heads with Flaco. He was just trying to fly up under the radar, do his time, and make it back home. However, the one thing that became obvious about Flaco off the rip when he took over is that he started to invest way too much of his time on money and getting dope in. Squeak said that he was consumed with it. All he would talk about is different ways of getting it smuggled in or imposing policies that would make it mandatory for some of the Sureños to start bringing it in through the visiting. But Squeaks, on the other hand, he did acknowledge that this is to be expected, based on the fact that any established leadership's primary objective is to always become self-sufficient and self-supporting. In prison, the only way to become self-sustaining is through the sale of drugs, selling cell phones that have been smuggled in, and then through whatever money's being generated from your street crews. That's if you're fortunate enough to have somebody working out on the streets. I mean, that's where the money's at. Unfortunately for these criminal organizations, there's no money in selling hobby and craft items, and the fundraiser drives just don't work. But I guess Squeak's point was that Flaco became consumed with this, and that everything out there on the yard, including their own security, fell real low on his list of priorities. So according to Squeak, at some point, Flaco became aware of the fact that Tick was slinging a lot of dope when he was on the 2 yard, and that he still had those resources. Tick had a system worked out with his wife where she would bring it in the visiting room, and over the course of time, they mastered the drop. I talked about this before in several of my other stories. The drop, how you pass dope, when you pass it, and the drop is important. Knowing when to pass it, when not to pass it, knowing when the COs are looking, not looking nervous. There's a lot of things that come into play with that. But either way, Tick and his wife, they had it worked out. They had it down to a science. She knew exactly when to pass it, how to do it, and up until someone told on him, his system was flawless. His girl never panicked, she never raised any suspicion, and Tick had all his bases covered. But when Flaco caught wind of this, he started to try to encourage Tick to start bringing it back in again. But Tick was done with all that. He caught time behind someone telling on him. They jacked up his points, and besides all that, Tick's wife had made it very clear that she was done with all that. Guys like Flaco who've never been in a real relationship, they don't understand things like that. Nor do they have the wherewithal to create these kind of resources. They depend on other people to do it for them. And these are the type of things that can weigh on a relationship, especially when there's kids involved. You know, your girl, she's always going to be a team player and she's always going to have your back when it comes to things like this. But once you get caught up and they see the detrimental effects that it causes, this sometimes has the ability to shake them loose, and it makes them realize that they're helping you get caught up. They're basically enabling you or enabling you. And this is where Tick and his wife were at with things. They had already talked about it, and at that point they had agreed that they weren't going to do it anymore. It got to the point where Tick's old lady told him, look, you stop doing that, you stop getting high, and I'll make sure that you got everything that you need in here, regardless of whatever it is. Money on your books, packages, magazines, appliances, special purchases, and visits on the weekends. Whatever you need. So for Tick, this just wasn't in the cards for him anymore. And it had already gotten to the point where it had started to cause problems in his relationship. And it had already reached the point to where it was causing a lot of stress on his marriage. But then things ended up going in another direction. The sureños on that yard didn't have any resource. Nobody was bringing it in through the visiting room. They didn't have no COs in pocket. They didn't have a way of smuggling it in. They didn't have nothing out there. So they were depending on somebody to step up and make something happen for the sake of the whole yard. And again, like I said from the onset, Susanville is the type of prison that had a lot of first termers. A lot of these guys didn't know how to get drugs in. A lot of them didn't have that kind of finesse. They didn't have that kind of experience yet. So this ended up weighing more on guys like Tick who had done it before. Everything on that yard kind of shifted to where the Norteños, they had everything. They had all the drugs, they had all the cell phones, and they were making all the money out there. And Flaco, he honed in on this. He used this as his pitch to get Tick back online. He was like, come on, brother. It's now come down to our people depending on us to make something happen, insofar as our own ability to maintain any level of sustainment. According to Squeaks, Tick had already conceded long before Flaco tried to influence him. He'd already seen the writing on the wall. There were a lot of sureños out there that didn't even have the ability to get hygiene items, and they were hungry. It's bad when you're in prison and you don't go to the store. You need outside help. You need to be able to go to the store. They just don't feed you enough in there. Besides that, that's where you get all your necessities from. Squeak said it got so bad out there that a lot of their homies, they didn't have shit. And for a lot of them, if they didn't have personal resources to fall back on, an old lady, a wife, family, the yard didn't have the resources to take care of them either. So it ended up getting bad out there. Even the tienda, or the store that's usually maintained to help those less fortunate, was completely depleted. It was at this point that Tick knew that he had to get back online. Not because this is what Flaco wanted, but more so for the sake and well-being for his own people. So as dreaded as it was, he knew that he had to have another conversation with his wife. And all he could hope for at that point is that it wouldn't jeopardize his marriage or the relationship that he had with his kids. So what Tick ends up doing is he borrowed a phone. At that time, he didn't have a phone. He ends up borrowing a phone and he breaches that conversation with his girl. He explains everything to her. And as to be expected, it was a tough conversation. She didn't like it. She threw a lot of different hypotheticals at him. What if you get busted? What if I get busted? What if they take the kids? What's gonna happen? Who's gonna take care of them? Who's gonna take care of our place? Tough questions that Tick couldn't give her answers for. In the end, she didn't like it, but ultimately she agreed to start doing it again. So within a couple of weeks, Tick starts getting dope in again. They start pushing it on the yard. They're back in competition now. Tick restocks the tienda and he starts helping out as many sureños on that yard as he could. So on occasion, Tick would slide a $50 paper to different sureños on a rotating basis. He'd hand him a $50 paper and he'd tell him, hey homie, go get your locker restocked up. Go get all your hygiene items, go stock up on soups, get everything that you need. Aside from that, he put several sureños in pocket out there, and like I said, they became competitive again on that yard. Aside from that, Tick put several sureños in pocket, and like I said, they started to be competitive on that yard again. The Norteños weren't the only ones that had cell phones and dope out there. It ended up being a win-win across the board. But just when things started to look up, here comes Flaco starting to push an agenda that ended up being more self-serving than anything else. Flaco approaches Tick and he tells him that he wants action at buying the whole stash, everything that he gets brought in. But Tick tells him no. He's like, nah, bro, I got to take care of myself. There's people on this yard that I got to take care of. And for me, it's counterproductive. He even tells Flaco, look, you can even shoot me an address. I'll send money to that address to help the casa out myself. but I'm not going to sell everything I got coming into you. It's just not to my benefit. You know, not to get off track, but another point that Squeaks made from watching my stories is this. He said, you know, it's funny how you often bring up the fact that a lot of what you do for these criminal organizations is often overlooked. But an even bigger point that he said is something that I've said in many of my past stories, and that's that no matter how much you do for these guys, regardless of how much you accomplish or the amount of sacrifices that you make, they're quick to forget about all this over one single act. And this is true. Your accomplishments, your accolades, and your sacrifices mean absolutely nothing when you end up falling into a situation where you're faced with some type of adversity. Whether it's your integrity that's being questioned, whether it's because you stand up for yourself and no longer allow yourself to be pushed and pulled by the tyrants, or whether it's behind some other type of trivial issue that's motivated by someone else's personal agenda. These situations end up being the reasons why everything that you've ever done is wiped all the way out by a single act. There goes your so-called career. Ponder on that and think about it for a minute. But yet, you're expected to show unconditional loyalty with no limits and no barriers. Why is this fair? Again, this isn't poison or rhetoric that's being spewed by a sour DO who's still bitter. I'm so far over all that stuff that it's no longer relevant to me. Trust me on that. But I still think it's an honest, open-ended question that deserves to be answered. So Squeak said that from a Sureño's perspective, he felt more at peace when everybody was still stuck in the back, when everybody was still in the chute. Because besides the power struggles, he believed that there were less people getting hurt or going to the other side. He believed that there were less people getting hurt or going to the other side because of dirty politics. But once everybody came out, a lot of things were being fabricated. Whoever had phone action was the one on top, and it just became different. He went on to say that he's seen the whole change. He said he got busted in 2007 and paroled in 2021. So he's seen the whole transition. And this is how he described it. He said, some of the Bealies were cool, and then some weren't. And then others were like, here's my dirty shirt. Wash it, hold it, or do something with it. I like those shoes. I want this. I want that. And that this is when he personally became aware of how the tyranny had infected his people. So anyway, Squeak said that Tick refused to sell Flacco his old stash for multiple reasons. And one of them is because that when Tick approached his old lady about bringing drugs back in, her whole position changed as well. Like she had said, she told him if he stopped, that she would take care of him and that she would make sure that he had everything he needed. But that since he started selling dope again, she told him that she wasn't going to continue to go out of her way to make those sacrifices. That he had the means now to take care of himself and that this is what she expected. So again, this would have been counterproductive for Tick. Not only that, but Squeak said that Tick liked to take care of certain people and that if he sold Flacco his entire stash, that he wouldn't be able to do that anymore. The other scandalous thing that Squeak said Flacco was doing was that he had his moles in all the different buildings. And he specifically had people watching everything that him, Tick, and several others were doing. And that he specifically had people watching him, Tick, and several others. Squeak said every now and then, Tick would see that one of the homies didn't have nothing. That, you know, their lockers were empty. So he'd walk up to their cell, he'd hand them a $50 paper, and he'd tell them, hey homie, here's a $50 paper. Go sell it and get your locker restocked with canteen. But Flacco apparently had people watching Tick so tough that these guys were being taxed every time Tick would give somebody a $50 paper. That Flacco would impose a tax on these guys, and that it became clear that Flacco was only about sucking the life out of their people. And this was a separate tax that they were already obligated to pay. They were already subjected to pay a third of anything they got to the kitty. So when Tick would look out for these guys, his whole purpose was to allow these guys to bypass that tax and to cut them a break so that they could recoup. This was just love that he was showing his people. And it just so happened to be that Tick was the one that was holding the tienda. He was the one that was responsible for restocking it and for making sure that when a new arrival pulled up, that they got everything that they needed, as far as cosmetics and anything else that they might have needed. But because they had so many newcomers that were coming to the yard, Tick was trying to avoid these guys that didn't have nothing on the yard from pulling from the kitty so that they would have something for the newcomers. Make sense? Because at around this time in 2017, 2018, this is when they started blending the yards. The yards that they were calling the NDPF yards, or the non-designated programming facilities. So there was a lot of sureños on the level 1 and 2 yards that were getting off on the S and Y inmates and were coming to the 3 yard. And this is why Tick was trying to do everything he could to preserve the tienda for the newcomers. So in essence, because of this imposed taxation on fellow sureños, they were even being taxed in situations like this when somebody was just showing love. Those are the kind of things that are morale breakers. That's how you kill the morale on the yard, by doing shit like that. CDCR eventually halted this form of forced integration after it was discovered that this policy was uncodified. They basically couldn't justify the riots, the stabbings, and the violent assaults that this effectuation was causing. I believe the courts intervened sometime in September of 2022, ordering CDCR to immediately cease transferring inmates under this controversial new housing policy. And this only came after an inmate by the name of Israel Villarreal filed a writ of mandate exposing that the non-designated programming facility policy violated the APA, or the Administrative Procedure Act. In other words, the policy was deemed as an underground regulation that was void based on legalities. The courts really didn't get into the grimy specifics of the policy. They just struck it down based on the legalities that were involved alone. So Squeaks goes on to give example after example of how Flaco continued to tax his own people at any given opportunity that he could. He said Flaco was taking people's food, that if they had green dots, he would ask them to relinquish the numbers, and that he'd give them their change. What do you want? I'll make you a store list, etc., etc., etc. He was doing a lot of scandalous shit. Hearing the descriptions were crazy. But as I listened to everything that he was telling me, I couldn't help but think that someone like Flaco is only going to get away with what people allow him to get away with. I don't care what kind of authority he was vested with or who he was working for. At some point, you got to call his bluff and put a stop to his shenanigans. Otherwise, he's just going to continue to keep taking whatever he can. Squeaks went on to say that there was a sureño that came from the 2 yard that had just went through a major surgery and was wearing a colostomy bag. And despite of this guy's dire medical condition, Flaco still continued to mandate a rigorous 45-minute exercise routine. Squeak said the dude looked like he was dying, like he was getting ready to pass out. But yet, Flaco continued to make these exercises mandatory for this guy. Squeak said that at one point, Tick approached Flaco and addressed the issue. He said, "Hey bro, this guy just came out of surgery. He's got shit and piss tubes hanging out everywhere. How do you expect this guy to work out like this?" And this guy that was wearing the colostomy bag, he didn't want to say nothing because he was scared. He was scared that if he said something, it might have some type of adverse effect on his standings. So he just bit the bullet. But again, Tick told Flaco, man, cut the dude a break. From the way it sounded, Flaco wasn't what you would consider to be a hardline leader. He was being a dictator. And he had these dudes so intimidated by the line he was pushing that it sounded like he killed their voices, that they were scared to speak up for themselves. When I heard about this, it was kind of like deja vu all over again for me. I seen the same thing happen with the NR, with our people, with the Nuestra Raza. In the 80s and early 90s, it used to be about unity, working together and encouraging these guys to speak up and use their voices if they ever seen anything that they think could have been done better. This concept was reinforced by continuing to let them know that they were all an integral part of the team and that everyone's standings was relevant. This way they were made to feel like they mattered and that there was a genuine concern for their well-being. At every juncture, we always placed a considerable amount of emphasis on telling them to use their voices and to always speak up when they had ideas. But then over the years, the NR became infested with rogue members that no longer cared about these things. Instead, these individuals were only focused on their own personal gain and what they could do to further their own political standings. This eventually ended up changing everything, including the sense of carnalismo and unity that was once promoted throughout the ranks. Instead of these guys feeling like they had a relevant voice and that they were being encouraged to speak up, they started to feel like they were being shut down and like their voices no longer mattered. Or that if they spoke up and addressed something, that they were bucking the system and complaining. This kind of sounds like this is what happened in Susanville, only on a smaller scale. And then you hear about things like these guys walking around with entourages. This only compounded and exasperated things even more. Squeak said that it ended up getting so bad that you couldn't even talk to certain individuals out there on the yard unless you made an appointment. Needless to say, things on that yard just continued to deteriorate, and it was just one thing after another. So at one point, Squeak said there were two sureños that were celled up with each other, and these two ended up going to blows because they got into it, and they ended up going to blows in their cell because they got into some type of disagreement, and one ended up calling the other one a bitch. So they got off on each other in their cell. Oh, shoot. So these two go at it. They get a few rounds in, and this apparently gets back to Flaco. He hears about it. Flaco, in turn, brings this to the attention of the Mesa. They talk about it, and they decide to look into it. That particular situation ended up creating some animosity on the yard between different sureños. I don't know if it was LA County, Orange County, SGV. I don't know who it was. I don't know who was involved. But according to Squeaks, that kind of escalated everything. So the Mesa, they end up sitting down with these two sureños for the purpose of trying to resolve the issue. But these two sureños weren't trying to resolve it. They were trying to take it to the next level. These guys wanted to strap up and deal with it in the cell. Flaco's position was that we're all sureños. We're not supposed to be fighting against each other. Flaco's position was that we're all sureños. We're not supposed to fight. We're supposed to be unified out here together on this yard. And that's a no-no. We're all on the same team. He tells these two guys that they needed to squash it, but this ended up falling on deaf ears. It ended up getting to the point where sides were being chosen, and it started to become bigger than what it needed to be. A lot of the pushback was coming from the sureño that was called a bitch, just solely on the fact that that word was used. It didn't help that this guy was also a YA baby. He grew up from a young age knowing that that's a word that you just don't use. And if you do, there's always protocol that you need to follow. In prison, one of the worst things you can call someone besides a rat is a bitch or a punk. Those are fighting words. And if someone calls you a bitch or a punk, you're expected to take flight right there on the spot. Those are fighting words. And if someone calls you a bitch or a punk, you're expected to take flight right there on the spot. No questions asked. If you don't, you lose all sense of respect from everyone, not only your people, but everyone out there on the yard. This is like one of those unwritten rules when it comes to the convict code, and it can escalate fast. So the sureño that was called a bitch, he couldn't let it go. And a lot of it was probably more so out of the fear of how he would be looked at if he did let it go. Almost like once that bell's rung, there's not too much you can do to fix it. So ultimately, in the end, when all attempts to resolve this issue failed, the Mesa agreed to let these two individuals go into a cell strapped up and basically fight it out to the death. If that's what these guys wanted to do, they were going to allow them to do it. But here's where the conflict started and more problems were created. After the Mesa heard both versions from these sureños that got into that fight, they decided that they'd allow both of these individuals to go into a cell strapped up, but that they would only provide a banger to the sureño who got called a bitch. This obviously didn't sit right with Tick and a lot of other sureños on the yard. They felt like this was some form of favoritism and that both of these guys should be given an equal opportunity, regardless to who said what or who did what. Sending one in there with the banger, sending only one of them in there with the banger just seemed like bad leadership. Sending only one of them in there with the banger just seemed like the wrong thing to do. The Mesa said that their position on this was based on the fact that they heard both of these guys' versions of what happened. The Mesa said that their position on this was based on the fact that they heard this guy's story and that he was the one who disrespected the other guy first. And that furthermore, this is the reason why the other guy called him a bitch. After going back and forth about this, Tick tried to get the Mesa to change their position on this. He said, give them both an equal opportunity to go in there and handle their business. And whoever comes out, comes out. But keep it fair. But they said they weren't going to budge on it. This was what they decided, and that's the way it was going to be, period. So according to Squeaks, Tick, he felt compelled to assist this sureño. He was a fellow sureño, and he felt compelled to assist him just based on the way he was educated, the way he was schooled. It wasn't about choosing sides because he said he would have done the same thing for the other guy. This was more about what was right and wrong and how he was educated, how he was schooled as a sureño. So Tick, he goes and gets at this sureño and he basically puts him up on game. He tells him everything that's happening. He said, look, they're going to let you guys go in a cell, and as it looks as of now, they're just going to give him a banger. They're not going to assist you with one. And then he explains their reasoning why. Then he tells him, look, I'm actually the one that is appointed to hold the pieces in this block, and one of the pieces that's going to be provided to this other guy. So you need to get something adequate to keep this fair. The piece that they were going to give to this other guy was a fan rod sharpened to a point. But what ended up happening is that Tick told this guy that he was going to assist him with the piece. He was going to give him his piece. But at the same time, he wanted him to be well aware of something. He said, if you tell these guys that I assisted you with the piece, or that I had anything to do with it, I'm gonna deny it to the fullest. And then I'm gonna make sure that you get what you got coming to you. Tick then tells him that he's helping him because he feels like it's the right thing to do, but that if he burned him, he'd invest all his resources to go after him. Tick said, I'm just trying to give you a fair chance because I think what they're doing is wrong. Needless to say, this guy tells Tick that he understands, and he assures him that he's not gonna throw his name out there. He's not gonna throw him under the bus. He has no reason to do that. That he appreciates him assisting him, and that this is just going to stay between them two. So long story short, these two sureños end up going into a cell and they get it in. And according to Squeaks, they actually ended up stabbing each other up pretty good. But fortunately for them both, neither one of them got hit in any of their vital organs, such as the heart, lungs, liver, kidney, or any of their arteries. Both of them end up going to medical. They patch him up. They take him to the hole. Nothing else was ever said about it. So after that incident, a similar incident took place about a week later on the yard between two other sureños. Only this time it happened right in front of Flaco and the Mesa that were out on the yard. These two sureños, they get into a heated argument. These two get into a heated argument. One calls the other one out of his name, and the fight's on. So they're out there on the yard and they're getting it in. Bing, bop, bing, bop, 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 bop. They go at it for a little bit and then they stop. They get separated. The gunners don't see it, so they split them up, and Flaco approaches one of them that he knows from the streets. This ended up being one of his boys. And after this guy tells Flaco what happened and why they got into it, Flaco tells this guy, if that would have been me, I would have strapped up and I would have blasted that individual. And this guy tells Flaco, I would have, but I didn't have a piece on me. What does Flaco do? He eggs him on. He knew exactly what he was doing. Flaco just so happened to have a tomahawk out on the yard that day. He ends up handing that tomahawk to his homeboy, and he tells him, go handle your business. That dude disrespected you. You got every right to go slice him up. For those of you that don't know what a tomahawk is, it's basically a slashing instrument, a razor blade. A razor blade that's fashioned so that it can be used to slice someone up. There's different ways of making them, but basically what it is just a loose razor with a cardboard backing and a little bit of nylon wrapped around it so you don't cut your finger. And that's all it is. It's just a loose razor. So according to Squeaks, sureños are not supposed to use tomahawks against each other. They just don't do it. If they're gonna strap up, they'll use bangers, but razor blades are supposed to be off limits. So after Flaco encourages this guy to use this tomahawk, and after he gives it to him, this guy walks over to the other sureño that he had gotten into it with, and he slices him up right there on the yard. At that point, Squeaks said that Tick had felt like he had seen enough, that he knew he had to do something to get Flaco off the yard, that he had seen enough of Flaco's antics, and that he was going to reach out to some of the Phillies that he was in contact with and let them know what was happening on that yard. But here's where it gets a little interesting, and it kind of shows you how relationships are forged on these yards between norteños and sureños. At the time when all this was going on, Tick didn't have a cell phone. He didn't have his own phone, and he didn't want to go to another sureño and use their phone because he didn't want this to get back to Flaco, put him in a compromised position. Obviously, if he did that and it got back to Flaco, it would put him in a compromised position. So Tick knew that he had to be real discreet when going about this. Because again, reason being, if this got back to the wrong ears, this could put Tick in a precarious situation with not only Flaco, but also with the Mesa, who were brainwashed with Flaco's deceptive tactics. So what Tick does is he gets at one of the norteños that he had a cool relationship with. And he gets at this norteño because he knows that this norteño has a cell phone. And he knew that he could trust this particular norteño to keep this under wraps because this norteño, he wasn't even supposed to have this cell phone. Because of all the stringent policies, the complications, and the headaches that come with having a cell phone, there's norteños out there on these yards that who have phones but don't report it to their leadership. And again, this is because of all the obligations, the strict policies, and everything that comes with having a cell phone. But this is a risky chance that they're taking, because if they're caught with an unreported phone that they're not supposed to have, there's all kind of speculations and assumptions that could come into play. And this will usually lead to them being removed or hit for deceiving leadership and for breaking serious policy. Anyways, this Norteño obviously trusted Tick enough to put him up on game as well. These two trusted each other. So Squeak said that Tick gets at this Norteño and he tells him, "Hey bro, I need to use your phone and it's for something extremely important." You don't even have to tell him to keep it between these two because it's already a secret as it is. So the Norteño, he agrees to let him use the phone. But Squeak said that every time Tick got the phone from this guy, it was like some 007 espionage type of shit. The Norteño would come out, put a bag of trash on the tier. Tick would come out, put his bag of trash next to his, pick up the other bag, and then Tick would walk off with the bag of trash with the phone in it. Then he'd obviously take it back to his cell, get the phone, use it, do what he had to do, and then get it back to him in the same fashion. And it had to be done like this because both of these guys had reasons for not wanting their people to find out about it. So fast forward, Tick, he tries to reach out to Popeye, but he knew that this was going to be hit and miss because Popeye's secretaries were always changing their numbers. Sure enough, he calls Popeye's secretary and he can't get through. So when it becomes clear to Tick that he's not going to be able to get through to Popeye, he ultimately decides to reach out to Therico from Bassett, who's right there across the street in High Desert. And that's what he does. Tick calls Therico and he ends up getting them on the line. He gives Therico a complete rundown of everything that's been happening on that yard, everything that Flaco has done. He tells Therico how Flaco's been imposing his own tax schemes on fellow Sureños, all the way down to things like hobbycraft and candy wheels. He was taxing them for everything. He tells him how Flaco's been enforcing the policies and how he's not leading by example himself. Then he tells Therico about the two Sureños that strapped up and went into a cell with each other. And finally, about the situation that happened on the yard when Flaco assisted his homie with the tomahawk and this guy used it to slice up another Sureño. When Therico hears all this, he's pissed off. He's like, who the fuck does this guy think he is? So Therico tells him to go ahead and get rid of him. Have him removed, find new people, establish a new mesa, but I want you to stay there so that you can keep me abreast of everything that's going on. So about a week and a half after Tick talked to Therico on the phone, he was able to find 9 Sureños who were willing to whack Flaco and remove him with no questions asked. They even said that they would remove the mesa if that became necessary. These guys were willing to do it, and Squeak said that this is reflective of how much these guys didn't like Flaco. So Squeaks also mentioned another guy named Cisco from F Troop. He used to work in the kitchen, wiping down tables in the chow hall. Squeak said that Cisco used to live in the same building as Flaco, and that when Tick would come into the chow hall, Cisco would always tell him about everything that Flaco was doing in the building, all the scandalous shit that he was doing. He would always give Tick the dirt on Flaco, how he made everyone turn on their light at 6 in the morning to keep their lights on until 9 at night, and a bunch of other trivial policies that he wasn't even following himself. So Squeak said that one morning when Tick went into the chow hall, Cisco went on one of his rants about Flaco, saying that when the time comes, if Flaco needed to be removed, that he was willing to do it himself. When Tick hears this, he looks at his celly and then he tells Cisco, well, guess what, homeboy? Today's your lucky day. He tells Cisco that it's already been authorized and that anyone who decides to assist or participate, that he'll call Therico and let them hear Therico say it himself so that they know it's legit. But when it got real and Cisco heard this, he backed up like a yellow belly crawdad, claiming he never said he'd do it and that if he did, maybe he said it when he was drunk, yada, 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 yada. He was just talking out the side of his neck. Needless to say, they put him on the shit list and had him lined up for the next removal. So Tick has another conversation with Therico and brings him up to speed on everything that's happened since the last time they talked. He tells him about the plan that they devised and that there's 9 Sureños that are willing to participate in the removal. But Therico tells Tick like this, look, go ahead and get rid of Flaco. I'll talk to Popeye and tell him what's going on as soon as I get the chance to talk to him. Right now, he doesn't have phone action, but as soon as I get a chance, I'll let him know everything that's going on. You, on the other hand, don't have phone action either. The only phone you have access to is through this Norteño, and you can't use it without being all secretive. We also run a big risk of possibly getting him caught up, so we got to be smarter about this. So soon after this conversation, Tick, he gets at these 9 sureños and they decide that they were going to remove Flaco that same day. Tick obviously knew that it wasn't going to take all 9 of these guys to remove Flaco. The plan was that 3 of them were going to go and the other 6 were just going to act as reinforcements. So these guys, they end up catching Flaco out on the yard and they rush him. Nobody on the yard knew that this was going to happen except those that were directly involved. And like I said, initially only 3 out of the 9 sureños were going to rush Flaco. But what ended up happening is when these 3 rushed Flaco, Travi, the paisa that was on the mesa, he backed Flaco up and went to assist him. So this ended up turning into a small melee. It basically ended up being 9 against 2. So what ended up happening is this. When the 3 sureños that were selected to remove Flaco, when they rushed him, Travi, the paisa that was on the mesa, he jumped in and backed Flaco up. So this ended up getting the other 6 involved. It ended up turning into a small melee where it was 9 against 2. And the other thing that Squeak said is, as tough as Flaco acted out there on the yard, he made no attempt whatsoever to fight back. He got rushed and he basically balled up on the ground. So after these guys rush Flaco, they lay the yard down, they come out, squad comes out, they cuff these guys up and they take them out of the hole. About 20 minutes later, after the incident, they ended up letting them all come back out to the yard. These guys all claimed that it was just a big misunderstanding, so squad agreed to let all these guys go back out to the yard. The first thing that Flaco does when he comes back to the yard is he makes a beeline straight for Tick's cell. He walks up to Tick's cell and he tells Tick, he's like, hey bro, he's like, what was all that about? And nobody told Flaco that Tick was involved. Flaco knew that Tick was the only other sureño on that yard that had the kind of influence or that type of influence that could make something like that happen. But Tick, he's straight up with him. He tells Flaco, he's like, hey bro, he's like, I reported everything that's been happening on this yard to Terco, and that basically that's what happens when you go around abusing your authority. Whether Flaco liked it or not, he had to eat it. This directive came from a reputable Mexican mafia member, so there wasn't nothing he could say about it. But the double cross was already in the works. Popeye, he ends up finding out about this incident and he wasn't happy about it. I don't know if he felt like Tick was out of line for jumping channels or if it just wasn't Tick's place to initiate the things that he did. But in the end, he ended up fining Tick $1,000 for the way it was handled. On top of that $1,000, another $800 was tacked on for clavo that Tick supposedly picked up for the house. And this money was owed to Flaco. And most of that clavo got lost to debts by guys who owed and got transferred out to other prisons. So Tick's luck just turned for the worse. On the other hand, Tick was well aware of how Popeye operated. Popeye was a no tolerance, kill now, ask questions later type of Mexican mafia member. He'd seen Popeye's work plenty of times in the past. Popeye would find someone and then once they paid their fine, he'd have them disposed of. Tick, he wasn't happy about the $1,000 fine either. He righteously felt like he did the right thing and he was hard pressed about not putting the burden of this fine on his girl. He told Popeye's secretary, I'll pay what I owe, but it's gonna take me some time because right now I just don't have the money or the resources to do it. To make matters worse, Tick had a ride or die wife who didn't want to see him get caught up over a debt. So she ended up taking her personal jewelry, a lot of it that had sentimental value attached to it, and pawning it off to help Tick pay off this debt. But again, Tick had worked under Popeye enough to know what was probably going to happen. And sure enough, he was right. After he paid off his $1,800 fine, he seen the writing on the wall. The new mesa that he had established started doing a lot of underhanded shit behind his back, and they started working against him, basically setting him up for future failure. One of the main ones was a guy named Goofy from Walnut. So 3 days after Tick pays off his fine, in conjunction with the whole Mexican Independence Day on September 16th, they send a 3-man crew on Tick. And at that point, he had been down long enough where he had mastered the ability to be able to read a yard and to see all the red flags that most people usually miss. Whether it's a break in monotony, a change in character, an uncharacteristic look, or something else that makes your spidey senses tingle. He felt that something was off kilter that day. According to Squeaks, Tick was on the yard by the pull-up bars, getting ready to go up and do a set when 3 guys walked up behind him and took flight on him. He heard the telltale footsteps behind him, but by then it was too late. They were already on him. So they get on him. Oh shoot. So they get on him. They don't stab him. which was a good sign for him. They just put hands on him and it was just a basic removal. But here's the thing. So the day before this incident happens, Tick Selly ended up getting rolled up after he got caught with the weapon. They came in the cell, they searched the cell, and they found a banger in the cell. So they ended up rolling up Tick Selly the day before Tick got rushed on the yard. But this would actually work in Tick's favor. When Tick gets to the hole, one of the lieutenants tells Tick that he knew that this was Tick's discipline for getting caught with a weapon. That he was aware of the fact that his cellie had gotten rolled up the day before, and that he knew that this was just his discipline for losing a weapon. So Tick was given the option of signing a release of liability, and he ends up getting kicked back out to the yard. So as soon as he gets back out to the yard, he reaches out to Popeye, who he often refers to as Pops, and he asks him why this happened to him. Popeye's secretary tells him that it was just a DP and that it was for playing with Popeye's money, and that furthermore, it was for making moves without checking in with him first. As I had assumed earlier, I knew it probably had something to do with channel jumping. A lot of these older guys that are in positions of authority, they'll take it the wrong way if you go through someone else and get authorization for something that they're in control of, almost as if you're undermining their authority. As part of Tick's relegation, he was stripped of his position and he was told to stay out of the politics. In Tick's mind, Popeye gave him a major pass, as these ain't my words, this is what Tick told Squeaks. It became inherently obvious that he felt like Pops had done him a huge favor. Pops let me live. He allowed me to parole and make it back home to my family, as long as I abided by the terms that he set, and for that, I'm grateful. Ironically, Squeak said that the new Mesa that Tick appointed ended up being a lot worse than Flaco. These guys were whacking good sureños over the pettiest shit, and their favorite tool was the 39-second checada, or the hands-on beatdowns. It kind of changed Squeak's and Tick's perspectives a little bit, but at that point, like a lot of the youngsters who he had attempted to help at one time, Tick's voice was now silenced with the rest of them. You know, this story has a lot of things to take away from. It gives you another perspective on the type of hardline politics that continue to be pushed out there on these main lines. It also demonstrates the advantages of having a cell phone and the amount of control one can levy with one. There's lesson after lesson to learn from if you really pay attention to how different things have become out there. However, the one thing that's always lurking somewhere in the shadows is karma. Popeye lived by the sword, but in the end, he would also die by the sword. On June 11, 2020, Raul Alvarado, a fellow Mexican mafia member who they call Spy from Lennox, and Edward Cisneros meted out their own form of punishment on Popeye. And this was obviously an effectuation that was authorized by the MA as a whole. Popeye wielded too much power, and when you become that big, it's just a matter of time before they knock you down. He was repeatedly stabbed in the neck, head, face, and body until his body was lifeless. In closing, these guys that have the ability to play God and who garner control over who lives and who dies is a powerful thing. Those of you who have never been to these types of sinister environments can only imagine through these stories how bad it really is in there. I really hope you guys are paying attention. Some of these lessons are invaluable. Those of us who have been there and who know exactly what I'm talking about. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I want to thank all of you for tapping in and for continuing to support the channel. As this one goes out, I'm already working on the next one. You guys enjoy the rest of your week and keep pushing that positivity. This your boy B, and I'm gone.